Let's talk about the performance model of sex. Now, this is coming from Millar's article, where he also talks about the commodity model of sex. Right now, we're going to focus in on the performance model. So, very first thing, the performance model of sex is not about performativity. So, for those of you who know that term, I know it's really easy to think that that's what Millar is really getting at. It's not. The words just happen to sound the same. If you aren't familiar with the word performativity, do not even worry about it. It's not what he's talking about, so you don't need to know it. Okay, so Millar is really genuinely talking about performance. And especially, he's thinking about musical performances. And he argues that using this model as a framework for thinking about sex and sexual interactions opens up new ways of understanding both what sexual interactions can be like and different ways to support and enable flourishing sexual interactions. So, when we're thinking about musical performances, we don't hold that a musician's value somehow decreases the more that they play. What a strange thought that would be, right? Instead, we know that the more someone has played music, the more they've been able to hone their skills, to practice, and especially the more they've been able to figure out what kind of music they like to play, that they enjoy playing. We can still recognize that there can be something, maybe exciting or special about the very first time someone gets up on stage to perform. That can be a big moment for them. Yay. But that doesn't mean that the performance itself was inherently more valuable than the performance they give 10 years later or 20 years later. And it certainly isn't the case that the musician's value as a person somehow decreases after that first performance. So we can use this as a model for thinking about sexual interactions. Continuing on with thinking about musical performances, there can be just a great deal of beauty and value in a solo performance. There can also be a great deal of beauty and value in a duet. Once again, there can be so much wonderfulness and value in an orchestra ensemble or a jazz band. There are all of these different possible configurations, and we don't have to rank these different kinds of musical performances and say that one is necessarily better than the other. They're just different, and they can be differently wonderful, and people can enjoy them in different kinds of ways. Different things work for different people. We also don't slot people into gender roles within a band or within an orchestra. We don't assume that folks of one gender are all expected to perform just one kind of instrument, always in the same musical style. Nor do we hold up certain gender configurations of performers as somehow better or more real than others. A duet involving a man and a woman is somehow not more real as a musical performance than, say, a trio of women all playing together or any other configuration. The performance model of sex doesn't fall into the same hetero and cis-normative conceptions of sex that we saw in the commodity model of sex and in the standard conceptions of sex. It doesn't slot people into gender roles within the sexual encounter or center heteronormative interactions. Instead, the performance model of sex recognizes that individuals each have their own unique preferences and desires, and that there can be a variety of different kinds of encounters, all of which can be valuable. The performance model of sex uses the model of affirmative consent. This means that it conceives of consent not as a single moment of yes or no, but as an ongoing process. Not only does it require ongoing affirmative consent, it requires ongoing communication. Sexual communication includes communication about consent, but also communication about things like desires, preferences, and much more. The performance model of sex calls for ongoing sexual communication before, during, and after the sexual encounter. Beforehand about what one would like to do, during to check in about how everyone's doing, and talking afterwards about how it all went and what one might want to try doing differently next time. Millar encourages us to use the performance model of sex as a way to understand sexual interactions as an ongoing and often collaborative experience. If this is a sexual experience that involves other people, it's necessary, it is built in that it is a collaborative process involving ongoing engagement with one another. Anyone who's ever performed in a band knows that it's essential to work together to make sure everyone is on the same beat, that everyone knows what's going on, everyone is aware of where they are in the performance. You have to be constantly attentive to how everyone else is doing. Under the performance model of sex, it would be very obviously insufficient if the only check-in was to ask, do you consent to perform with me at the very start of the performance? And then there was no communication or engagement beyond that. Not only would the performance itself just fully break down on stage, but this isn't what it is to play in a band. You're not even doing the activity at this point, right? Sometimes people who are using the commodity model of sex think of, a non-consensual sexual interaction as one in which there was sex that just lacked consent. That is incoherent on the performance model of sex. On the performance model of sex, if there isn't ongoing affirmative consent and ongoing communication and checking in, it is not even doing the activity, right? It is not even qualifying as doing the kind of activity one would do in order to have a sexual encounter. All right, so within this, the performance model of sex opens up space to recognize and value a variety of different kinds of sexual encounters. It eschews those hierarchies that we're so used to, that are so embedded in our social world. Instead, it holds up the possibility for sexual encounters that center pleasure, growth, learning and experimentation, and most essentially, when with others, collaboration. So we can start to think about different kinds of sexual encounters. It would be so boring if our world only had, I don't know, country music, for example. That music can be great, but it would be really quite unpleasant and boring if it was the only musical option, especially if everyone were expected to listen to and play country music all the time. It is a wonderful feature of our world that there are so many possibilities. And we don't have to build in hierarchies about what everyone else should value. Although it's entirely fine to value just one particular thing or one set of particular things for oneself. So the performance model of sex doesn't require that everybody be engaging in, this wide variety of different kinds of sexual encounters. Rather, the performance model of sex holds space to recognize all of those different kinds of sexual interactions as valuable and activities in which one might choose to engage. Right? It doesn't pressure people into any one thing. Also, notice how in the performance model of sex, it doesn't stigmatize or devalue paid performances. Getting a paying gig is great. Wealthy musicians are revered all the time in our world, right? So the performance model of sex doesn't assume that sexual encounters can or should only occur out of pure enthusiasm, or that it somehow is a lesser experience if that sexual encounter is either done as part of paid labor or if one is paying for that type of labor. Rather, the performance model of sex treats things like sex work as one out of many scenarios in which flourishing and agential sexual encounters can occur. So the performance model of sex opens up all of these new spaces and ways of thinking about these things. It opens up possibilities to better recognize and support sexual agency for everyone involved.